Up next, Deepti Kalaran is back with us on set, this time to talk about the major stories in newspapers around the world. Deepti, let's start with protests by the Dalit community in India, also known as the Untouchables.
Well, a protest movement led by that community, the Dalit community or Untouchables, have virtually paralyzed the city of Mumbai since Monday as the Dalit committee leads protests against the government, really calling for the Indian government to respect and recognize their rights. And it's making the front pages of several Indian papers today. The Times of India has a rather cynical take on the protests. They call the Dalit demonstrators mobs who are holding the city to ransom.
These protests are perhaps a sign of growing unrest in India, at least according to The Independent. That's worrying.
Well, The Independent has a really good explainer on this crisis, which is quite complicated. And in this article from The Independent, they explain that the conflict dates back to New Year's Day, when tens of thousands of Dalits traveled to a small village to commemorate the bicentenary of a battle between British forces and Hindu rulers, in which the Untouchables actually fought alongside the British in what was largely seen as one step towards their freedom. Well, Hindu nationalists then attacked the group who had traveled to this small village. They actually killed one man, prompting these counter-protests in Mumbai. The Independent explains that the Dalits were hoping Narendra Modi would deliver on promises of social equality, social change, particularly protection against violence and rape that really is quite prevalent against the Dalit community. His failure to do so, and now these protests, is, quote, an advance warning of bigger rage to come.
Okay, we'll be keeping an eye on that. Let's move on now to Turkey. A banker who's been found guilty of helping Iran evade U.S. sanctions.
That's right. It's a really underreported story. Quite interesting. The case has fueled diplomatic tensions between Turkey and the U.S. A Manhattan federal court has found a Turkish banker, Mehmet Hakan Atilla, guilty of five counts, including bank fraud and conspiracy. Now, he was an executive at a Turkish state-owned bank called Halkbank. The scheme involved bribing Turkish government officials and helping Iran escape sanctions, essentially by using fraudulent gold and food transactions, apparently something that the Turkish president may have been aware of. Now, the Turkish leader, for his part, has denied these claims, but U.S. prosecutors say, once again, it's a lesson to foreign banks and bankers that you're either with the U.S. or you're against them. We've heard that one before.
We have. Now, in Germany there is an interesting and perhaps a controversial study that's being published that attributes rising crime rates to migrant arrivals.
That's right. The study does need a little bit of explaining. Basically, it was conducted in one state of Germany. That state is Lower Saxony. It was paid for by a German ministry. Police found an increase of 10.4% in reported violent crimes. So I'm stressing reported violent crimes in 2015 and 2016. 90% of that increase is attributed to migrants, mainly from North Africa. There are some caveats, though, as I said. The authors of the study say that violent crimes committed by migrants are twice as likely to be reported than violent crimes committed by German nationals. The other caveat is that the study does not imply that refugees are more criminal than German nationals. Far from it. This is just one example. But the stats will no doubt be fodder for Angela Merkel's critics, who she was already facing a lot of criticism around over taking in 1 million migrants in 2015.
That's right. And so for your last story, reactions to that tell-all book that's soon to be released on Donald Trump and his time in the White House.
Well, that book is called Fire and Fury. It's written by journalist Michael Wolff, an explosive tell-all, as you said, into the world, the very crazy world of Donald Trump. Now, excerpts have been published by New York Magazine. As you see here, one of the key takeaways was that Donald Trump did not ever really want to be president, despite running to be president. Now, Mashable has rather helpfully put together 14 major takeaways from this book, which is yet to be published. We learn things like, Trump never wanted to be president, that his entourage and he himself were shocked when he did actually become president. There are some weirder details, too, like Trump's fear of being poisoned. I quote, "That's one reason why he likes to eat at McDonald's, because the food was safely pre-made." Also, Trump, like many of his critics, we learn, hated his own inauguration ceremony.
Right, a highly criticized ceremony. Then we end with some questions, though, around this author, Michael Wolff. Who is this guy?
Well, he is a journalist, but he does, according to the Chicago Tribune, have a penchant for pushing facts, quote, as far as they'll go and sometimes further than they can tolerate. The Chicago Tribune describes him as a provocateur and media polemicist who's been accused in the past of, quote, creating scenes wholesale in his previous books and columns.
Sounds like fake news to me. Thank you so much,
I didn't say it.
Deeptika Laurent. I did. We'll be back in just a few minutes after the break. Thank you so much for joining us, and do stay tuned. There's more news coming up.